All right, guys. So today we're hitting chapter 11. Now, chapter 11 is the final chapter in this unit that I'm covering. There's chapter 12. It's more about religion, um, some literature is in there, Emerson, Thoreau, and then even some women's rights if you're into that sort of thing. But we're actually skipping it because our dismissal is cut short. So unit 3, we've covered 8, 9, 10, and now 11 to wrap it up. And this one is really all about the South and its relationship with slavery. So I'm going to start actually with a movie trailer to show you guys. I want you guys to watch this. Um, it is a remake of a um, actually, it was a television series decades ago. This is a remake. If you may have heard about this, came out a few years ago. Um, if my computer will load as you guys are watching this and we're waiting. Here we go.
You must hear your name first. You are Plantation, son of Emory and Plantation. You must always honor your ancestors, the ones who love you and watch over you.
It's time your family faith will die.
I own this property, boy. Let's be honest.
There is no Sabbath without slavery.
But God is my witness. I say you, even if he brought you tomorrow, your love, it will never die.
A name is who you is. My daddy took whippings night and day to protect his name.
Speak to me, Lord! Speak to me, Lord! You don't know me, my dad?
You haven't touched just one. I'll kill you.
You brought this upon yourself and upon your poor family.
No, you brought it on my family.
But there's a way to show for you Christ. So always feel now to the peace of the way where your curse may stay. Where I swear to the ways where you will remain.
We got the same blood part. You was a slave too. You just never knew it. Your name is your spirit. Your name is your shield.
So I want to start off with that for a couple of reasons. One, usually when I get students, they've never really been exposed to some of the worst parts about slavery, um, including from rape, torture, killing, kidnapping from people from the continent of Africa, the treacherous journey, which we've talked about before, called the Middle Passage, all the way to what we know now as slavery in America and how it expanded. Roots goes in detail and shows you the most horrific things that you did not learn about when you're in junior high or even in high school in general, because you're limited in what you can actually show. But also depends on where you grew up. In some places, in some states, race and slavery is talked about openly. Other places like the South, it's almost not told, but imply that it should be forgotten. And it's important to recognize it was of the past, including exactly what went through. It's you never understand what it's like to have your son taken away from you on the auction block as he begs and cries for his daddy to stay with him. You'll never know that. You'll never know what's like to know that your wife, one woman you love, is raped by the master and has children you can't do anything about. You will never know, but it's important to understand and acknowledge that. Watching that trailer should make you upset, no matter what color you are. In that case, I should put you in your right mind as to what we're talking about when we talk about slavery in the South and what it meant, because we're leading up to a civil war in 1860. So why did so many white Southerners actually support the role of slavery when so few actually owned slaves themselves? And there's a couple of ideas your book pulls from. One was the social status. Was it like that idea that, hey, I want to own a very nice vehicle. I want to own a Rolls Royce, Bentley, is it social status? Even if you didn't have a slave, was your desire to ultimately get one to put you up there? And no matter how poor you were, you could always say, at least I wasn't at the level of a slave, at least I'm above that. So it's a lot of these are social status themselves. The third and final one is racism itself. And that's actually comes from Africa, from perceptions of Africa from Europeans. You can take that all the way back to the British, who, when they colonized Africa, referred to these people as brutes and gorillas and apes, and how they feared for them and things like that, because of what they could do to them, and that their lives were essentially uncivilized for many reasons. One, maybe they didn't have the same technology. The culture is different. The religion is different. We know now different religions does not mean uncivilized. It means different religions, right? But at that point in time, that grew in Europe and spread across the ocean to America. And so there's a lot of questions like, why do so many Southerners do this, support this institution of slavery, even though they didn't have slaves themselves? And there's two popular points of views about this that I would argue. And you have two right here. With Gone with the Wind, comes out much later, not during this time period, but it shows the magical side of Southern plantation, of the Southern belle falling in love, on their view of slave owners as the paternal, as a father to the slaves, and that they need them, and that life wasn't that tough. That's Gone with the Wind. It's now a movie. It was a novel. It's now a movie. But it showed that the South, it wasn't that bad. Slavery wasn't really that bad. It created a myth. Versus Uncle Tom's Cabin, that showed the brutality of slavery. Abe Lincoln would actually say that this book helped lead to the Civil War. And a lot of people would argue this thing so huge in the North, and people read about what was going on in the South of slavery, and they were appalled because it showed the reality of slavery and the brutality of slavery. So two different perceptions throughout these two perceptions represent the South and the North, essentially, how they viewed slavery, and they're pretty good examples. Now, looking at this map, I want you guys to understand this. The South was different. They did have one thing in common, and that was holding on to slavery. But things had changed quite a bit over time. There's three different parts I want to talk about. The Lower South, they're known for labor-intensive cotton plantations, mainly really Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. They're going to be huge on slavery. Texas as well, not as much. As you imagine, cotton has trouble growing in some climates in Texas, but Texas is huge, right? So these states are going to be big on cotton plantations. By the time of 1860, by the time of Civil War, half the slave population is actually here in the deep, what we call the Lower South, or some people call it the Deep South here. And remember, during the American Revolution, majority of slaves were actually in Virginia, all right, and South Carolina. But now we've seen the move over here. Whites in the South worried about revolutions such as the one in Haiti that was successful. The French is going to actually end slavery in their colonies by 1800. So the South is really worried about slave revolts and things that they've seen that they try to make sure their slaves do not know about. The Lower South, they're the ones that's leading the transportation of slaves into their new territory. The Virginia and this area here, what we would call the Middle South, they're not so reliant on one crop anymore, tobacco or cotton. And most of these slaves, when we shifted over here, moved to be sold over. Actually, over 2/3 would be moved into new territories to be sold. That's it. So while the international slave trade is illegal, the domestic inside the United States is flourishing. Okay, these are the ones that are going to vote for to leave the United States first. These deep South, the Middle South here, and light red. Where are you? They're not so reliant on one particular cotton. At one point in time, it was tobacco. Tobacco destroyed the nutrients in the soil, and the cotton just didn't grow that well in this area. So they're not as heavy, reliable on slavery and a specific crop for those slaves for the certain crop. Okay, and then you have the Upper South. It's actually been started to decline in these areas. Before Civil War is over, actually, slavery won't exist in West Virginia and other states along the borders. And in the North, they've already declined the issue of slavery. Now, you're thinking, what does this have to do with immigrants at all? Because we did talk about immigrants before. But the Irish and most immigrants from China going to California, they never traveled to the South, which isn't surprising. They found work right away in California. And New York, where many Irish people and other European immigrants came through, they never traveled down to the South for a couple reasons. One, they couldn't find work. People had slaves in the South, and if they did have to pay for some skilled labor, they're free slaves. Not really in the South, more like in the northern states, but there were quite a few spread out all over. So Irish immigrants and European immigrants never went south because they wouldn't find work. There would be too much competition with slavery and freed slaves. Also, there's not a lot of railroads that go north to south necessarily compared to when you talk about going west and a little bit later. You see a lot more there. But they're just not going to follow through. It wasn't profitable for immigrants to do that. So the South, how is it so different? I do want you guys to know a couple of things. Tobacco itself is so bad for soil, and after generations, it's not your main crop anymore. It's actually pretty much downtrodden. It actually creates an issue because there's so many slaves in the area, but there's not enough work. So we're going to start seeing many slave owners rent out their slaves, if not sell them outright. Slaves became so expensive into the Southern economy that if you took all the slaves and their estimated worth that owners had paid for them, they'd be worth more than the banks, railroads, and factories in the North combined. So essentially, it no longer, we were talking about how they say cotton is king, you dare not mess with cotton. Not in all of the South. It was the cost of slave themselves because they're so valuable. Once you get rid of the international slave trade, and there was a need for them in the farther deep South, they become so valuable that they're worth more than banks, railroads, and factories in the North. So it was an issue of slavery itself. We're going to talk much about that later. Okay, so one thing you should ask, all right, well, the North didn't need slaves. They switched to manufacturing. And so eventually slavery had gotten rid of slavery in the North. And a lot of founding fathers, when they wrote the Constitution, they thought it was just a matter of time before slavery was done away with. Eventually, it'd be gone. Eventually find a peaceful solution for this. And some in the South did want to diversify the economy. Those pretty intelligent ones realized we can't always rely on a crop. Look what happened with tobacco in Virginia. And some didn't like the fact that we always have to rely on the North. We've got to ship cotton out to them in huge numbers, usually by waterway because cotton's so light. It takes up a lot of room, so it took up too much room for a railroad, really. But it was really great for the ocean because it was so light. You can pack a whole bunch on a steamship or boat in general. And so many of them did want to do this. Many of them did have this idea that, hey, let's manufacture on our own. We don't rely on the North. Why didn't it work? Attempts to manufacturing failed. There's a whole bunch of reasons we look at this, but some of the first utmost ones, many slave owners did not believe blacks were suited for factories. They didn't think they could do the work. They would argue it's too complex or they can't be trusted. They can only do one thing, that's pick cotton, apparently. Many in the South hated factories in general. That's a very Jeffersonian idea. Factory meant big city and despised big cities. Jefferson himself hated that too. So that was an idea in the South in general. And many did want to proceed not just from owning land, but also owning slaves. I feel like modern times we say, hey, we own 4 acres. That's great. That's wonderful. I own 20 acres. I've seen people say, oh, I don't have that much land. It's only 20 acres. That's 20 acres. That's quite a bit. back then, lands and slaves are also almost interchangeable in that concept of I own this many. So it's something to consider why manufacturing never happened in the South. It did try in major areas, but it just failed continuously. This is a famous quote you have always heard: "You dare not make war on cotton. No power on earth dare make war upon it." Cotton is king as a major crop in the South. Now, really, we know this. It's not the cotton itself that's the issue. It's who is picking the cotton, the labor that's getting done for free. And when we look at this and we're trying to figure out what was going on, we do this before every war and every society. How did it lead up to this? This is one thing we got to look at. The majority of people in the South did not own slaves. And if they did, it was very few. Let's look at these numbers. Society in about 1860, when Civil War broke out, 8% of owners owned 5 or more slaves, only 8%. Okay. You were called a planter if you owned 20 slaves. That was only 4%. 50 more slaves was only 0.12% of the population. Okay. 50% of the population were whites that owned no slaves. 32% were actually slaves. 2% were freed African slaves. Some actually came from the southern colonies, the Caribbean colonies from the French. So when we look at this, you realize majority of people aren't slave owners at all. So why would they fight in the Civil War? Why would they push so hard to keep slavery? Why did they try so much? Here is an engraving of, I suppose this is actually in Louisiana, how cotton is shipped out. You can see why you would want to use water transportation for cotton. It's light, but you can pack lots on a ship and move it compared to a railroad cart when you couldn't fit that much cotton on there. The problem there wasn't weight, it was size. And even Galveston and Baytown itself has a history. During the Civil War, you'll actually know that Baytown was known for, Baytown and Galveston secretly snuck cotton out. When the Union had pretty much surrounded and was strangling the South, especially, but with their strong Navy. There's actually one boat was actually made. They opened a shipyard, and some guys in the name of the Confederacy opened up a shipyard right here in Baytown, and they produced one ship for sure that it got past the northern blockade that kept ships coming in and out from the South. And they would commandeer a few more. So even Baytown has a history of that, and many more out of Galveston to smuggle cotton out to trade it and sell it to European countries because Confederates are so desperate for money. So it's pretty interesting how that we're in a southern Gulf Coast, so there is a history with cotton connected to here. It didn't seem as much as those Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, those plantations, but there is a history here. Now the white middle class, and this was majority of white males. Very few had slaves. They were called yeomen for small landowners. Very small. They couldn't afford slaves. Most of them were willing to leave and find work somewhere else. Many of them didn't even own land. Wherever it was available, they were willing to go. And of course, they feared free slaves. They looked at free slaves as work competition. So in their eyes, they would be 110% against slaves. Because what do you do when you liberate 4 million slaves and they're competition for your work? So that's been a theory of why white middle class. Okay. Now, on the plantation itself, what life was like, it was basic double standard. Your book goes in more detail about the plantation life. We won't. But there was a big double standard. Women had to live a perfect Christian life. So you're expected to do that. But the man practiced self-indulgence like no other. The woman, the wife, and even the mistresses of the owners had to live those perfect lives. The wife of a planter was in charge of the domestic side of the plantation, and she often had to complain about, quote unquote, what they called mulattoes. That self-indulgence that the owner actually and planter practiced was raping his own workers. The women that worked inside typically were house servants. It wasn't uncommon for her to all of a sudden be pregnant and her baby come out mixed, and the wife of the planter, she would see that and complain about it. And many times she would end up sending them out. She would complain about them until he sold them, or sent them out into the field to do field work, and even if they were women. So it was double standard for women, even in the plantation household. And even though the man did this, the women would complain about it, but never to the man himself. It was kind of hush hush, and he was able to do it with nothing stopping him. That was 110% common. Now, as far as freed slaves goes, there were some that became free. The textbook didn't go into this, but if you do more research, you'll see that once the French actually get rid of slavery in the colonies, there's a huge number of freed peoples from the Caribbean that come up to the United States, including free colored people, as they say, free persons of color, who owned slaves themselves, actually came up into the United States. Virginia was a big area about it. And they also often brought freed slaves with them too. And so we see this quite a bit, migration from the Caribbean islands to the United States. But if you look at the numbers, at 4 million, roughly 260,000. And some slave owners, even some slaves in the United States, eventually became slave owners themselves. That number is hard to pinpoint because some bought families and loved ones bought them for their freedom, but technically they would own them, right? So that's an issue too. Again, like I said, with no international slave trade, we're going to see slave value increased so much that people from those tobacco colonies like Virginia and North Carolina, huge numbers, they're making money off bringing these slaves to these new states in the South. And you actually see this spread from 1820 in just 40 years. So like not even from beginning of this unit, we talk about 1800 to War of 1812, not even that far back. You know, each dot represents 200 slaves. To put it in perspective for you, you can see we're growing rapidly in all over the United States, especially in the Deep South. From barely having any dots, you can see quite a few now. Okay, so rural versus urban. Urban slaves often rented out, entirely different life as blacksmiths, as shopkeepers. They could be sent out to run a shop or run a cart on the streets in the north or something like that, or major cities. That was actually pretty common, and they would have to return. They'd be rented out for work, essentially. Blacksmith, anything like that. Rural in the countryside, much different. You have household slaves and you have field slaves. And typically women were considered household slaves, but many times women were field slaves as well. Slave women specifically were valued more. And it's just like what you're thinking, because they could become pregnant and produce another slave. It's horrible to think about that, but these slave owners treated slave women like almost as if they were precious cattle. It's horrible to say. I don't think of them like that. I don't think anybody should, but that's the way they treat them. They promised to give them less work and more food if they were to get pregnant, and encourage them to get pregnant as much as possible, with no guarantee of not separating the children. That's very much an issue and a problem that happened quite a bit, especially when some of these guys went bankrupt and some of these farmers just failed, and their slaves were auctioned off to whoever was available, and families were torn apart, if you can imagine that. Children torn apart from their families to live miles and miles away from some stranger. Okay, they were also given time off after birth and treated fairly well before they were forced to go back after. Not always, but many times things like this were done to help convince them to give birth and get pregnant. If you want to know a perfect example of slavery in the South, Celia is actually a true story. She born double burden, slave and a woman at 14 years old. She's bought, and her slave owner begins to rape her. After 5 years of this, she kills him self-defense. And of course, she goes to court and she's pleading self-defense. And the courts say, "You're a slave. You can't even hold trial. So your trial is not logistic. You're guilty. The end. Executed." So this was pretty much the case. No matter what, if a slave defended themselves, this is often the case that happened. If a slave killed their white master, regardless, it was always death penalty for them. And no matter what, there wasn't such thing as self-defense. And in the South, it was slaves didn't have legal status at all, and so they couldn't even bring charges or anything against their slave owners or defend themselves. Okay, and with the slave community itself, we do see a bond, and your textbooks talks about this, and they point out to research that shows it still exists. But slaves often were separated so quickly at any moment that instead of forming bonds based on relations, blood, like father son, it was often they formed bonds of common experiences, either from agricultural work or the type of master that they had, a slave owner that they had to deal with. That often seems that African Americans have done that even now, according to your book. That research shows that African Americans often have a connection on close shared experiences that they have in common versus blood. That's up for debate, I think. African American religion and folklore. So slaves were drawn. Christianity was very inviting to them. Many of them did try to practice religion from their homeland, and it was often a mixture of Christianity. Sometimes we see this, especially in Deep South. But slaves warmed to the idea of Christianity because there's a promise of a better world awaiting them. And this is a promise that religion has in general, for most part, was that no matter what you suffer here, if you do good things while you're alive and do what you're supposed to here, you'll be rewarded in a future life. So Christianity was very welcoming. By 1860, 20% of slaves were actually Christian. And they're often slave preachers. Nat Turner is one we're going to talk about in just a second. I'm actually going to show this trailer towards the end, this movie trailer towards the end. But there were slave preachers meant to help convince slaves to stay loyal. It's biblical, and this movie is a perfect example of that. But we'll come back to that in a second. There are other examples of slave rebellions. If you've seen this, you know where I'm heading. Slave George, although this wasn't a slave rebellion, it's worth mentioning, but Thomas Jefferson's nephews were mourning the loss of their mother. It had been over a year. They were drunk, and their 17-year-old, one of their slaves, 17-year-old, would drop the water pitcher that once belonged to their mother. And an angry fury, they tied him down to the ground, made all the slaves come in the room, and then they chopped him in his neck first, killed him in horror in front of all their slaves, and then demanded that the slaves light a fire, dismember him, and burn his body. And while this was happening, to 2 a.m., there happened to be an earthquake that came at the very time. It's the largest earthquake ever hit U.S., continental U.S., and it actually destroyed the chimney and everything. And they tell slaves to rebuild the chimney, rebuild it all, and hide his body parts in the chimney. And you're thinking, why do they hide it? Because he's a slave. Thomas Jefferson's nephew should be able to get away with it. Virginia and many states had rules against torturing slaves. I know that sounds very hypocritical because they allowed whippings and beatings and rape, and that's essentially is torturing. But outright torturing and hacking up could create a problem because it would upset many slaves and could help lead to rebellion. So many states had laws against this, so much that when George's skeleton was found in the street by an animal, a dog had brought up the skeleton, had found it, that they're going to realize it's the slave George who's gone missing. They're going to go question Jefferson nephews, their slaves, and they're going to tell these people what happened. And both of them actually arrested for this. They both go out on bail, and one will commit suicide, and the other one flees, and we think he might have died in the War of 1812. We don't even know. So that was an interesting case, Slave George, if you want to look it out. It's very interesting because people have looked at it and said, this is entitlement at its best. These guys thought they could get away with this because of who their family was. Slave rebellions did happen. Even no matter how bad things got, slave rebellions did happen, but they always met with an opposite force that was almost always an overreaction. Conspirators were killed immediately, and anybody thought to be a conspirator as well. Gabriel's rebellion is a really interesting one. It was a slave who was rented out for work, blacksmith, near Richmond, Virginia. And essentially he apparently was attempting to form a rebellion, but his two slaves actually informed their masters, and he's before he can initiate this rebellion, he's found out. He flees. He's actually captured. He actually is able to get on a boat to get away, and the person that sells him out is another slave who's selling him out for the reward of $300 so he could buy his own freedom. And it turns out there's a book written in 1993 that went into detail about this and had a lot of good primary sources and we pretty much take this for a fact because it's such a good book, that Gabriel's intention was actually to kidnap the governor of Virginia at the time was Monroe, hold him ransom until they ended slavery. And now we're pretty sure that the French were supporting him and convincing him to do this. Some French nationalists, not necessarily the French government themselves, but some French nationalists, because a lot of French people wanted to end slavery and a lot of them wanted to disrupt that within the United States. Now, the reason why this doesn't come out is because this is at a time when Jefferson was president. And remember, he's a Democrat Republican and they're really close with France. And so they're pretty much, those letters that were sent to Monroe when he was governor at the time, way before he was president, never come out to court. They're pretty much hidden from the court. But we do know that the French were involved later. Now we realize that the French were involved. But Jefferson probably wouldn't have got reelected or elected at all if people found out that the French were involved in this. But it's just one of many instances. He actually, not one white was killed in that, but he is going to be hung. So his brothers, when he's captured, and 23 other people. But there was estimates that up to 700 conspirators were involved in this. We know he had 2 white people that were trying to help him as well. But Gabriel's Rebellion is an interesting one as well. You should check it out. Nat Turner is the most famous one. And that's what our video is about. We're going to watch Birth of a Nation. In Virginia, he actually is successful in killing 57 whites. That's a huge number. People feared him so much. He's going to avoid capture for 6 weeks before he's caught and executed. And after this is when and there's another slave rebellion as well shortly after this, that Virginia is going to really tighten up its laws on slavery. They start making laws where slaves were not allowed to read or write. Before this, they were. They actually told all freed slaves at one point, you have a certain number of years to leave Virginia or you will be considered a slave again. And then the only people that could stay in Virginia had to have like a letter or brought to court from a friend that had to be white to say that these were good people, even though they're freed slaves. So these rebellions had a reaction. And Gabriel himself was likely thought that he heard about the Haitian Revolution, how successful it was. And because he was rented out, he was able to travel pretty freely. So even after all this, one of the laws that Virginia cracks down on is you can't travel freely. You have to be rented out, and if you're not rented from one spot to another one, it got very strict in Virginia, and in the South, other places in the South as well, because of all these slave rebellions they were scared of. So this is actually a drawing of Nat Turner's rebellion. I want you to look at this. This is how bad media is. For the longest time, it was always a violent Nat Turner perception that he was a monster. Like this picture alone should show you that he's a monster cutting off the head of a white young boy. But by all accounts, if you've written or watched the movie trailer or watch a movie, you'll see a different view. So let's take a second to watch that. And I think it's important because for the most part, he's not, for years, he was seen as a brute, vicious. And now we look back and say, hey, Nat Turner was fighting for his freedom, which is a cornerstone of America in general, right? If you can't remember as far back as the American Revolution, that worries me that if you can't compare the two. But take a look at this movie trailer.
The southern trees, bearing strange fruit.
Heavenly Father, we come to thank you for your word and your will.
Blood on the leaves, and blood at the roots.
You listen to him, and you might just make it into heaven. Amen.
Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze.
Submit yourselves to your masters with all respect.
Strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees.
Brethren, I pray you sing a new song.
sing praise in the assembly of the righteous. Let the saints be joyful in glory. Let the high praise of God be on the mouths of the saints, and a two-edged sword in their hand to execute vengeance on the demonic nations, and punishment on those peoples, to bind their kings with chains. This I have all his saints. Praise the Lord! Praise the Lord! Sing to him a new song!
So this is actually one of the Birth of Nations, one of the movies you can do your movie review on. But it shows how it talks about the preachers, like we talked about in this, in this chapter, how they used Christianity to help reinforce slavery, but how you can use some similar Bible verses to do the exact opposite. So Nat Turner is a perfect example of point of view can change dramatically, and depends who tells the story of how you feel about Nat Turner. In the end, it's one thing that we can't argue is that the South, even though it's very distinct from mid, lower to the northern South, one thing that always helped them stand as one was the issue of slavery. They all supported the issue of slavery. Not every person in the states, but all the states as a whole in general supported that. And whenever there were laws or any ideas that maybe perhaps slavery would be put to an end, the South became more stubborn and more resilient to fight against it, to fight against emancipation itself. And that kind of wraps up chapter 11. It's a very short chapter. It's some grueling, tough stuff to swallow, but it is part of history. And by not acknowledging it, we're not fixing it. If it can be fixed, right? All right, so that's it. Thank you very much.